Does the Legend of Zelda series exploit nostalgia for success? Oh, The Legend of Zelda. For just about any gamer, the story, the characters, or the music brings back some pretty strong feels. I'm not the only one who felt that, right? Even though it's been around forever, people are crazy about the series, perhaps troublingly so. Zelda symphonies, elaborate Hyrulean cosplay, and copious amounts of fan art dedicated to Link. But why, after nearly 3 decades and more than 20 different titles, does this series drive so much energy and excitement?
Or I swear to Kokiri Village, I'll slice the two of you into...
Is it just that the new games are so amazing? Or is it something else, a little more calculated? Is The Legend of Zelda's continued success due to an exploitation of nostalgia?
This is his entire Zelda collection.
Excuse me, princess.
But hold on a second. What is nostalgia anyway? First used by Swiss physicians in the 1600s, nostalgia was a mentally debilitating longing for one's homeland. Spending too much time fighting for foreign kings and missing your comfortable straw bed back home? Well, that was called nostalgia. And it's exactly those longings for home that keep drawing us back to, well, more than 20 different Zelda games. Of course, nostalgia can't be the only reason for Zelda's massive lifespan. To keep something relevant for more than 30 years, you gotta start with something pretty remarkable.
It's The Legend of Zelda and it's really rad. Those creatures from Ganon are pretty bad. It's Zelda. Awesome!
And to their credit, Zelda games are really good, and the original Legend of Zelda was a game changer. But I've noticed something. The Zelda games that people tend to have the fondest memories of are the ones that they played as a child. For some, it's Epona leaping the fence at Lon Lon Ranch in the Ocarina of Time. For others, it's discovering a fairy queen behind a waterfall after hearing about it in a playground rumor, of course. And for others still, it's being hopelessly stuck in the Phantom Hourglass like I was during a vacation in Florida. Pro tip, you have to close the DS to make the seal. Just trust me. Childhood memories even influenced Zelda's creator himself, Shigeru Miyamoto. According to an amazing New Yorker profile that I will link to in the description, The Legend of Zelda was based on Miyamoto's early childhood cave excursions in his hometown of Kyoto. It was a deeply personal allegory for adolescent exploration and escape. Another reason that we love Zelda is that we know exactly what we're getting. The stories might be different, but the world is persistent throughout. Early Zelda games had an overworld arrangement, while later ones made the shift to 3D, eventually sailing across the ocean's blue. Remember losing your way in the Lost Woods, finding the Master Sword in the cemetery, or collecting the shards of the Triforce? These adventures all built out that larger world piece by piece, despite changes in perspective and locale. Whenever we jump into a Zelda game, we're always coming back to that world. Even the Eternal Mario doesn't have this level of consistency when it comes to world building. You've got Mario Party, Mario Kart, Sonic and Mario go to the Olympics, and the list goes on. If you can tell me what universe Super Mario Sweater exists in, please be my guest. And yes, I know that Link and Sheik are part of the Super Smash Bros. Series, but so is like every Nintendo character, like the Game & Watch guy. I mean, who's next? The Wii Fit avatar? Oh, okay. Cool. And of course, imprinted in everyone's mind is Zelda's legendary sound. The triumphant of opening a treasure chest. The satisfying of finding a secret passage. Or Navi, just trying to get your attention, which is super annoying.
Hello?
Look,
What's up?
I know.
Hey, listen, hey.
The Legend of Zelda was one of the first game series to recognize that music and sound were part of the gameplay, a concept that the Ocarina of Time later developed. But wait, in their own way, the story, the world, and the music play to deep psychological impulses that feed nostalgia. For most of us, we played The Legend of Zelda during our formative years, so those ideas stay with us. Researchers at Columbia University studied how we make nostalgic attachments to various forms of media. It's different from person to person, but most people have their strongest nostalgia for things that they experienced from their teens to their early 20s. For me, that would be Stone Temple Pilots to Arrested Development, pre-Netflix. So it's not surprising that yet another opportunity to be a hero grabs us by the heartstrings. The persistent story and world of the new games is constantly calling you back to your original experience, creating a vortex of nostalgia that sucks you back into the past. It's not as bad as it sounds. As for those aforementioned seductive sounds and melodies in the Zelda franchise, new research suggests that music can be a phenomenal trigger for establishing nostalgic feelings. So, is The Legend of Zelda exploiting nostalgia to hook generation after generation? The answer is a resounding yes. Nintendo has created a nostalgia-producing machine in the guise of an adorable elf wearing a little green hat. It's a great master scheme to sustain a franchise forever. Nintendo should change their motto to hook 'em while they're young. They bake in these nostalgic qualities and release the game, targeted at kids, every few years to guarantee that every generation will be Zelda fans. As these kids grow up, they continue to play Zelda because it reminds them of the first time they played Zelda. They'll probably even play it with their own kids. I know I will. For example, Wind Waker HD and the 3D version of Ocarina of Time targets kids who maybe got a Wii U or 3DS for Christmas, but also targets big kids like me who played the GameCube or N64 version and want to revisit. A Link Between Worlds is a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, a 20-year-old Super Nintendo game that came out long before any of the kids who will play it were even born. So yes, Nintendo is exploiting our nostalgia, but as long as the games are good, then maybe the exploitation of our dearest memories isn't quite so bad. Unlike the new Golden Axe and Double Dragon releases, which drove their nostalgia into the abyss, Zelda has successfully built on top of its own legacy. And frankly, there are far worse things to exploit than nostalgia, like violence.
Don't make me laugh.
Moreover, nostalgia is actually good for us. Research has shown that people prone to nostalgia have higher self-esteem, find it easier to trust others, and suffer from less depression. So when we play as Link, we're not only remembering what it was like to play as a child, but we're also triggering all sorts of good vibes. And the end result is this living, breathing universe that can be entered or exited at any time. At any given moment, there's a kid somewhere who's entering Hyrule for the very first time. 25 years down the line, she'll probably be wondering why she gets so wistful and teary-eyed every time she hears the Legend of Zelda overworld theme. You and me both, sister. You and me both. So what do you think? Does The Legend of Zelda exploit our nostalgia? Hash it out in the comments, and if you like what you saw, please subscribe. I will see you next week.
Hey, so as you may notice, I am not in the studio right now, which maybe is a good thing because there's like 10 inches of snow in the ground, on the ground in New York right now. I'm in Las Vegas for the annual DICE conference, which means I wasn't able to record comments like I normally would, but I went through the comments from last week's episode about whether or not AI should be a part of competitive esports, and here's what I found. Let's take a look. Thomas Voss says he got a lot more out of this episode than maybe some of the other people did. Thank you very much, Thomas. I appreciate that. He had two things to add, both of which were very insightful. The first was acknowledging that that passing the Turing test doesn't mean that the players were better, the AI bots were better, but they were just playing more like humans, which I think was a good prompt for us to do this episode in the first place. But he adds something different. He actually asks about data input and alludes to the fact that Watson, for example, got a whole stream of information from Jeopardy. It's not like Alex Trebek was literally talking to Watson and then Watson responded. But in fact, they had to systematically introduce the data to this machine in a way that the machine would understand, which I think is a really good point, which is that that's an acknowledgement by the makers of, by the folks behind Jeopardy, that Watson was going to be part of the competition, and in fact, for there to be meaningful competition, that meant changing some of the ways that questions were ostensibly delivered. I think the same thing would have to happen with esports, where if we were going to introduce these AI elements, AI competitors, we'd have to speak to them in their own language, so to speak. So excellent point, Thomas. Vengeful Zukav also didn't like the idea of there being bots in esports, for the simple reason that players are already doing a lot of automatic calculations in their head, having memorization timers, etc. You know, it's really interesting that you and other commenters abide by the same kind of formalism that we find in other types of sports. The idea being that there is this platonic ideal of how a particular game of, say, League of Legends should be performed, and the introduction of new elements will sort of change the inherent value of that game system in and of itself, which is like just like the folks who behind FIFA, for example, don't like the introduction of new technologies. Instant replay was something that was really looked down upon in sports like baseball, and eventually people come to their wisdom. So it's interesting that people are, that all of you who don't like the idea of bots being introduced to esports have this kind of greater idea of like what esports is supposed to be. SquidB8 says that competition is testing the human condition, and introducing any kind of, say, prosthetics sort of changes the natural rhythm of the game itself. And you know, it's interesting because this is the big question that's happening in lots of places, not just in esports. A really good example is the Razor swimsuit that was used at the Summer Olympics a couple years ago that gave all the swimmers a particular advantage, or Oscar Pistorius' legs, which, you know, some argued gave him more spring, even up through the things that obviously the doping scandals that have ravaged you know, professional cycling. I think that the thing that's worth acknowledging is that I do think that all technology is assistive technology. There's a great essay about it in Abler and another follow-up on The Atlantic that I will link to in the description. But yeah, I think that this idea that if we introduce any form of technology, anything that helps us, all of a sudden that makes the sport itself suspect. And I think that that's been proven patently untrue, and you know, lots of different sports. The NASCAR analogy, Formula One we talked about, but also, you know, introducing like gloves that football players use that stick to almost anything. That's a type of technology. It's not a digital one, but it's a new type of technology that alters the game itself. Ivan Pozdiankov didn't like the idea that I called certain aspects of particular sports inane. I'm sorry if I offended anybody by that. All I was saying is that there are certain types of behaviors in esports, in different types of esports, whether it's Counter-Strike or looking at respawn times or whatever it might be, that I think are more primed to systemization than other ones. For example, in professional football, you notice a lot of quarterbacks have a little wristband on their arms that gives them signals for plays, for example, that helps them decide what audibles they want to choose. That's something that could be used by human memory, but instead they use a tool to help them sort of solve that dilemma, how to memorize a bunch of different things. I think the same thing could happen with particular esports. Yeah, and I do think you're right, like it's up to fans and ultimately the players to decide which types of behaviors actually make the most sense. Hurricane 310 says that the reason why he watches esports is for the human element. And I think that's an important thing to remember. I'm not saying that the whole point is for robots to just replace us and play by themselves, because I think that is kind of boring. But I think the question is whether those human abilities might actually make for ultimately more interesting public spectatorship of a particular game if we introduce more automated elements into them. But yeah, I agree. I think that there are human elements that, you know, sort of like can't be undone. I mean, those are ineffable. Manio Marseille makes an amazing point that in chess there are separate championships for humans and computers, and maybe that is something that will end up happening. We'll have a separate human round and a separate computer round, and I don't know, I guess we can watch it with our computer friends and invite them over, and then we can crack jokes with one another. Yeah, maybe I've gone too far.